The church bells of St. Matthew's tolled in the distance as the last remnants of daylight vanished behind the mountains surrounding Ardmore, Texas. Hank Barrett never paid them much mind, especially not on this particular evening in 1873, when the autumn wind carried something else to his ears, a sound that stood out against the gathering darkness and made him rein in his horse. A cry. Faint but unmistakable. Hank had spent enough nights on the open range to distinguish between the calls of coyotes and the sounds of human distress. This was definitely the latter. He turned his mount toward the small, whitewashed church that sat on the edge of town, its modest steeple barely visible against the darkening sky. He hadn't planned to stop in Ardmore at all. At 32, Hank had made his living driving cattle across Texas for the past decade, and this small town was merely supposed to be a brief waypoint before continuing south toward San Antonio with his earnings. But something about that sound tugged at him, pulling him away from his intended path. As he approached the church, the crying grew more distinct. It wasn't the wail of a baby as he'd first suspected, but the soft, muffled sobs of a woman trying desperately to keep quiet. Hank dismounted, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the ground. He looped his horse's reins around the hitching post and approached the steps. There, huddled against the church door with a thin shawl pulled around her shoulders, sat a young woman. Even in the dim light, he could make out her swollen belly beneath the fabric of her worn dress. She couldn't have been more than 20, with dark hair falling around her tear-streaked face. When she noticed his approach, she quickly tried to wipe away her tears, straightening her posture as much as her condition would allow. "Madam," Hank said, removing his hat and keeping a respectful distance. "Are you all right?" The woman's eyes, wide with fear, darted around as if looking for an escape. "I'm fine, sir, just resting a moment." Hank had encountered enough trouble in his life to recognize a desperate situation. The woman's face was gaunt, her clothes travel-worn, and the small bundle beside her suggested she carried everything she owned in this world. "You're not all right," he said softly, his voice gentler than his weathered appearance might suggest. He crouched down, still keeping a respectful distance. "And it's getting mighty cold to be sitting out here." The woman's composure crumbled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered, one hand protectively cradling her belly. "The pastor isn't here and the door is locked. I hoped." Hank looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the full measure of her situation. He'd seen plenty of hardship in his years, men broken by drought and debt, families displaced by war and poverty, but something about this woman's quiet dignity in the face of her desperate circumstances stirred something deep within him. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, clearly weighing whether to trust him. "Olivia," she finally said. "Olivia Nash, Miss Nash, I'm Hank Barrett." He gestured to her condition. "How far along are you?" 7 months, I think," she answered, her voice barely audible. "Maybe 8, I've lost track of the days." Hank nodded, processing this information. "And the father?" Olivia's expression hardened, a flash of pain crossing her features. "Gone, ran off when he found out, said he never signed up for a family." Her hand trembled slightly. "My parents disowned me. I had a position as a schoolteacher in Galveston, but they asked me to leave once they noticed." The cold wind whistled through the churchyard, making the woman shiver. Hank made his decision in that moment, pulling off his coat and offering it to her. "You're not alone anymore," he said simply, the words coming from somewhere he couldn't quite identify, perhaps from that part of him that still remembered what it was like to have nobody in the world who cared whether you lived or died. Olivia looked up at him, confusion and wariness in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm not leaving you on these church steps to freeze or starve," Hank said firmly. "There's a boarding house down the street. Mrs. Wilkins runs it, tough as leather but fair-minded. I was heading there myself for the night. You'll have a warm bed and a hot meal, at least until we figure something else out." "Why would you help me?" Olivia asked, suspicious of kindness after so much rejection. "You don't know me," Hank shrugged, his weathered face softening. My ma used to say that a person's character isn't measured by how they treat folks who can do something for them, but by how they treat those who can't. He extended his hand to help her up. Besides, winter's coming, not a time for anyone to be without shelter, especially not in your condition. Olivia hesitated, then placed her hand in his, allowing him to help her to her feet. The simple human contact, the first gentle touch she'd received in months, nearly broke her composure again. She stumbled slightly as she stood, and Hank steadied her with a respectful hand at her elbow. "I can't pay you," she admitted, clutching her small bundle of possessions. "I have almost nothing left." "I'm not asking for payment," Hank replied, guiding her toward his horse. "Can you ride? We can go slow." Olivia nodded, and with careful assistance, she found herself seated sideways on the saddle, Hank's coat wrapped around her shoulders. He took the reins and began walking the horse down the main street, conscious of his precious cargo. The town of Ardmore was small but growing, situated at a critical juncture where several cattle trails converged. Oil lamps glowed in windows, and piano music drifted from the saloon. A few townsfolk gave them curious glances as they passed, but Hank paid them no mind. His focus was entirely on getting Olivia somewhere safe and warm. Mrs. Wilkins' boarding house stood 3 stories tall, one of the more substantial buildings in Ardmore. The widow had built it after the war, using money from her late husband's railroad investments. As Hank helped Olivia down from the horse, the front door opened, and the formidable silhouette of Mrs. Wilkins appeared. "Mr. Barrett," she acknowledged with a nod, her eyes immediately taking in Olivia's condition. "I see you've brought company. Evening, Mrs. Wilkins," Hank said, his tone respectful but firm. "Miss Nash here needs lodging. I'll cover the cost for both of us." The older woman's eyes narrowed slightly as she assessed Olivia, but unlike many others who had turned the young woman away, Mrs. Wilkins' gaze held no judgment, only practical consideration. "Well, don't just stand there in the cold," she finally said, stepping back from the doorway. "Come in, both of you. I've got stew on the stove and fresh bread." Relief washed over Olivia's face as they entered the warmth of the boarding house. The entryway opened into a comfortable sitting room with a crackling fire. Several other boarders looked up from their newspapers and conversations, their curiosity obvious but their manners keeping them from openly staring. "Franklin," Mrs. Wilkins called to a young boy of about 12 who appeared from the back of the house. "Take Mr. Barrett's horse to the stable, then fetch Dr. Collins. Tell him we have a lady guest who might need his attention." "Yes, madam," the boy replied, darting outside to take the reins. Mrs. Wilkins turned to Olivia. "You look dead on your feet, child." "When's the last time you ate a proper meal?" Olivia hesitated. "2 days ago, madam. I had some bread yesterday." The older woman clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Well, that won't do, not in your condition. Come along to the kitchen while I get your rooms ready." As they followed Mrs. Wilkins through the house, Hank noticed Olivia's steps growing more unsteady. Without a word, he offered his arm, which she gratefully accepted. The simple gesture didn't go unnoticed by their hostess, whose expression softened almost imperceptibly. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of beef stew and baking bread. Mrs. Wilkins guided Olivia to a chair at the large wooden table and ladled a generous portion of stew into a bowl, placing it before her along with a thick slice of bread. "Eat slowly," she advised. "Your stomach won't thank you for rushing after going empty so long," Olivia nodded, tears of gratitude welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, looking from Mrs. Wilkins to Hank. "Both of you?" Hank simply nodded, uncomfortable with her thanks. He wasn't used to being looked at with such gratitude. Most of his interactions with others were straightforward business transactions: cattle sold, supplies bought, wages earned and paid. This was different. "I'll show you to your rooms after you've eaten," Mrs. Wilkins said. "Mr. Barrett, I assume you'll be wanting the same room as last time." "Yes, madam," Hank replied. "And whatever room is most comfortable for Miss Nash, something on the ground floor might be best." Mrs. Wilkins nodded. "I've got just the place. Used to be my sewing room, but it has a good bed and is right next to the kitchen. She won't have to climb any stairs." As Olivia ate, color gradually returned to her pale cheeks. Hank watched her surreptitiously, wondering what circumstances had led her to such desperate straits. She carried herself with an educated air. Her speech was refined despite her obvious exhaustion, and her manners spoke of good upbringing. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Dr. Collins, a middle-aged man with spectacles and a thoughtful expression. Mrs. Wilkins led him into the kitchen. "This is Miss Nash," she explained. "She's in a delicate condition and has been traveling hard from the looks of it." Dr. Collins nodded, approaching Olivia with a kind smile. "Miss Nash, I'm Dr. Collins. Would you permit me to examine you, just to ensure all is well with you and the baby?" Olivia looked to Hank as if seeking reassurance. He nodded encouragingly. "Dr. Collins delivered half the children in this county," Hank said. "He's a good man." This seemed to ease Olivia's mind. "Yes, thank you, doctor." Mrs. Wilkins cleared her throat. "I'll show you to your room for the examination. Mr. Barrett, why don't you help yourself to some stew? You look like you could use a meal yourself." As the women and doctor disappeared down the hallway, Hank found himself alone in the kitchen. He served himself a bowl of stew, realizing he was indeed hungry. His mind, however, was occupied with thoughts of Olivia Nash and what tomorrow might bring. He'd planned to be in Ardmore only for the night before continuing his journey. Now he couldn't imagine just riding away, leaving her to fend for herself. But what could he offer her? He was a cowhand, not a settled man. He didn't own property or have a regular home. His life was spent mostly in the saddle, moving with the seasons and the cattle. Yet something about Olivia stirred a long, dormant part of him, a part that yearned for something more permanent than the transient life he'd built for himself. Mrs. Wilkins returned to the kitchen nearly an hour later, her expression thoughtful. "Miss Nash is resting now, doctor. Collins says she's undernourished and exhausted, but the baby seems strong. She needs rest, good food, and no more hard traveling for a while." Hank nodded, having expected as much. "What does she owe for the doctor's visit?" "Nothing," Mrs. Wilkins replied, surprising him. "Doctor. Collins said to consider it his Christian duty. He'll check on her again in a few days." "That's mighty generous of him." Mrs. Wilkins fixed him with a penetrating look. "Now, Mr. Barrett, what exactly are your intentions regarding Miss Nash?" The directness of the question caught Hank off guard. "I found her alone and in trouble, couldn't just leave her there." Mrs. Wilkins said, clearly not entirely satisfied with this answer. "And what happens tomorrow or the next day? That girl needs stability, not just a night's charity." Hank shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "I don't rightly know yet, madam. I've got some money saved, enough to see her situated somewhere safe, at least until the baby comes." "I see," Mrs. Wilkins said, her tone softening slightly. "Well, she mentioned you told her she wasn't alone anymore." "That's quite a promise from a man who's never in one place long enough for the dust to settle." Her words struck home, making Hank realize the weight of what he'd said on the church steps. He hadn't been thinking clearly, had spoken from instinct rather than reason. Yet he couldn't bring himself to regret it. "I meant what I said," he replied quietly. "I'll figure something out." Mrs. Wilkins studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Your room is ready whenever you want it. Number 4, same as before." She turned to leave, then paused. "That girl in there has had enough people make promises they didn't keep, Mr. Barrett. I hope you're not planning to add your name to that list." With that parting remark, she left him alone with his thoughts and the remains of his stew. Hank slept poorly that night, his mind churning with possibilities and problems. By dawn, he had reached no clear conclusion about what to do next. He dressed and made his way downstairs, surprised to find Olivia already in the kitchen, seated at the table with a cup of tea. She looked better than she had the previous night. Her face was cleaned, her hair neatly arranged, and she wore a simple dress that must have been loaned to her by Mrs. Wilkins, as it was clearly not her own. When she saw him, she offered a hesitant smile. "Good morning, Mr. Barrett," she said. "I wanted to thank you properly for your kindness last night." "No need for thanks," Hank replied, accepting the cup of coffee Mrs. Wilkins handed him. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Olivia said firmly, "they wouldn't have, and we both know it." She looked down at her tea. "Doctor." Collins said I shouldn't travel anymore until after the baby comes. I'm not sure what I'm going to do. Before Hank could respond, Mrs. Wilkins spoke up. You'll stay here for now, child. I can always use an extra pair of hands even in your condition. You mentioned you were a school teacher. We're short on educated folks in Ardmore. Perhaps you could help with the ledgers and correspondence. Olivia's face brightened. I would be happy to earn my keep however I can, Mrs. Wilkins. Hank felt a wave of relief. At least she'd have shelter and work for the immediate future. But a boarding house was no place for a woman to have and raise a child alone, especially with the stigma that would follow her. I need to take care of some business in town, Hank said, finishing his coffee. I'll be back later if that's all right. This is a boarding house, Mr. Barrett, Mrs. Wilkins said dryly. Coming and going is what people do here. Hank nodded, placed his hat on his head, and headed out. The morning air was crisp, the town of Ardmore just coming to life as shopkeepers opened their doors and wagons began to arrive with goods and supplies. He made his way to the bank, where he withdrew a significant portion of his savings. Next, he visited the general store, the land office, and finally, the small law office on the main street. By mid-afternoon, he returned to the boarding house, finding Olivia in the parlor, mending what appeared to be table linens. She looked up when he entered, her needle pausing mid-stitch. Would you care to take a walk with me, Miss Nash? He asked. If you're feeling up to it, the doctor said some gentle exercise would be good for you. Olivia seemed surprised by the invitation but nodded. I would like that. Let me get my shawl. They walked slowly along the quieter streets of Ardmore, away from the bustle of the main thoroughfare. Olivia's steps were steadier today, though Hank remained close in case she needed support. Mrs. Wilkins says you're a cattle driver, Olivia said after they had walked in silence for a while. That's right, Hank confirmed. Been doing it since the war ended. Before that, I worked my father's farm until he passed, sold the land to pay his debts, and headed west. It must be a lonely life, Olivia observed. Hank had never thought about it quite that way. It's what I know, he replied simply. But yes, I suppose it can be. What about you? How did you come to be a school teacher? Olivia's face softened at the memory. My father was a minister. Education was highly valued in our home. I attended a women's college in Virginia before the war. Afterward, teaching positions were among the few respectable options for women who needed to support themselves. And you liked it. Teaching? Very much, she said, her eyes lighting up. There's something wonderful about watching a child understand something new for the first time. That moment when confusion turns to comprehension. She trailed off, one hand moving unconsciously to her belly. I had hoped to teach my own children someday, not quite like this though. They reached a small park at the edge of town, where a few benches faced a modest creek. Hank guided her to one, ensuring she was comfortable before sitting beside her. Miss Nash, he began, unusually hesitant. I've been thinking about your situation. Her expression became guarded. Mr. Barrett, you've already done more than enough, please, he interrupted gently. Hear me out. He took a deep breath. I've purchased a small property just outside of town, nothing fancy, 3 acres with a modest house and a barn. It belonged to old Mr. Thornton before he moved to San Antonio to live with his daughter. Olivia looked at him in confusion. That's wonderful for you, I suppose, but I bought it for you, Hank said, the words coming out in a rush. And the baby? Olivia stared at him, speechless. It's not charity, he continued quickly. It's an investment of sorts. The land is good. There's a garden already planted and enough room for a few animals. The house needs some work, but it's sound. You could live there, raise your child there. Mr. Barrett, Olivia finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, I cannot accept such an enormous gift. It's impossible. It's not a gift, Hank insisted. It's an arrangement. I still need to drive cattle, that's my livelihood, but I need somewhere to come back to between drives, somewhere to store my things, rest up. The property needs someone living there year-round, keeping it maintained. He met her eyes directly. You need a home, I need a caretaker for my property. It's a fair exchange. Olivia shook her head in disbelief. But why? Why would you do this for a stranger? Hank looked out at the creek, gathering his thoughts. When I found you on those church steps, something changed. I don't know how to explain it. He turned back to her. I've spent 10 years drifting, Miss Nash, moving from one cattle drive to the next, one town to another, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, and it suited me fine, or so I thought. He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. But seeing you there, alone and expecting a child, it made me realize I've been running from something too, the possibility of having connections, responsibilities beyond myself. He met her gaze. I'm not proposing anything improper. The house has 2 bedrooms. When I'm there, I'll stay in the smaller one. When I'm away, which will be often, the place is yours to manage as you see fit. Olivia was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. People will talk, she finally said. They always do. Let them, Hank replied. We'll know the truth of it. And what happens when you decide to settle down? When you meet someone you want to marry? The question caught Hank by surprise. The possibility seemed so remote that he hadn't considered it. That's not likely to happen anytime soon, if it ever did. Well, we'd figure something out. The property would still be yours to use as long as you needed it. Olivia studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. Finding none, she asked, May I see it, this property? Of course, Hank agreed readily. Tomorrow, if you're feeling strong enough, it's about a mile outside of town. She nodded slowly. I'll consider your offer, Mr. Barrett, but I need to be absolutely clear about something. Her voice took on a firmer tone. I won't be beholden to any man again. If I accept, it must truly be, as you say, a business arrangement, with clear terms that protect both my child and myself. Understood, Hank said. I've already spoken to Mr. Graves, the lawyer. He can draw up whatever documents would make you comfortable. This is your decision, Miss Nash. I won't pressure you. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. Olivia shivered slightly in the cooling air, and Hank immediately stood. We should head back before you catch a chill, he said, offering his arm. As they walked back toward the boarding house, Hank found himself hoping she would accept his proposal. The idea of having a place to return to, a purpose beyond the next cattle drive, it had taken root in his mind with surprising strength. When they reached Mrs. Wilkins' establishment, Olivia paused at the door. Thank you for the walk, Mr. Barrett, and for your unusual offer. I will give it careful thought tonight, Hank nodded, touching the brim of his hat. That's all I ask, Miss Nash. That evening, after a quiet dinner with the other boarders, Hank sat on the front porch, smoking his pipe and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The sound of the door opening behind him drew his attention. Mrs. Wilkins stepped out, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Miss Nash told me about your proposition, she said without preamble, settling into the chair beside him. Hank said nothing, waiting for her judgment. It's either the most foolish or the most decent thing I've ever heard, Mrs. Wilkins continued. Possibly both. And what did Miss Nash say? Hank asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. She's confused, suspicious, grateful, afraid. Mrs. Wilkins listed the emotions matter-of-factly. The girl's been through enough to make her wary of kindness, especially from a man, Hank nodded. I understand that. I'm not trying to complicate her life further. Aren't you? Mrs. Wilkins challenged. What you're offering, it's not simple, Mr. Barrett. It raises questions, creates talk, and sooner or later one or both of you will want more than a business arrangement. What happens then? Hank tapped his pipe against the porch railing, considering his words carefully. I don't have all the answers, Mrs. Wilkins. I just know I couldn't ride away and leave her to fate, not after finding her like that. The older woman studied him for a long moment. You're a better man than most, Hank Barrett, but good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. She stood, adjusting her shawl. Miss Nash asked me to tell you she'll view the property tomorrow. After that, she'll make her decision. With that, she returned inside, leaving Hank alone with the night sky and his thoughts. The next morning dawned clear and mild, a perfect day for the short journey to the Thornton property. Hank had arranged for Mrs. Wilkins' nephew to drive them in his wagon, ensuring Olivia wouldn't have to ride horseback. When Olivia emerged from the boarding house, Hank was struck by the transformation a few days of proper rest and food had made. Though still visibly with child, her face had lost its gaunt look, and there was a healthy glow to her complexion. She wore a borrowed dress that Mrs. Wilkins had altered to accommodate her condition, and her hair was neatly arranged beneath a simple bonnet. "Good morning, Miss Nash," Hank greeted her, helping her up into the wagon. "You're looking well today." "Thank you," she replied with a small smile. "I feel much better. Dr. Collins visited again this morning and says both the baby and I are improving." "That's good news," Hank said, climbing up beside her as Mrs. Wilkins' nephew Thomas took the reins. The ride to the property took about 20 minutes. As they approached, Hank felt an unexpected nervousness. He wanted Olivia to like the place, to see its potential as he had. The Thornton property was situated in a small valley, protected from the worst of the Texas winds by gentle hills. A creek ran along one edge of the land, providing a reliable source of water. The house itself was a simple structure, a single-story dwelling built of local stone and timber, with a covered porch stretching across the front. The barn stood about 50 yards away, weathered but solid. Thomas brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house, and Hank jumped down, turning to help Olivia descend. "It's not much to look at yet," he admitted as they approached the house. "But it's sturdy. Old Thornton built it to last." The interior was plain but clean. The previous owner had taken most of his possessions, but had left the larger furniture pieces, a table and chairs in the kitchen, a settee in the small parlor, beds in both bedrooms. Hank had spent part of the previous day cleaning and airing out the rooms, and had purchased some basic supplies to stock the kitchen. Olivia moved through the house slowly, taking in every detail. Her expression was difficult to read, but Hank noticed her lingering in the smaller of the two bedrooms, which had a window overlooking the garden. "This would make a nice nursery," she said quietly, almost to herself. Hank felt a surge of hope at her words. "Yes, it would. There's good light most of the day." They continued outside to inspect the garden, which was overgrown but still productive. Late-season vegetables were ready for harvesting, and fruit trees lined the southern edge of the property. "The soil is good here," Hank explained. "Thornton grew enough to feed himself and sell some in town. With proper tending, it could produce even more." Olivia nodded, one hand resting on her belly as she surveyed the land. "It's beautiful," she admitted. "Peaceful." They walked to the creek, where Hank pointed out the small dock Thornton had built for fishing. "The water runs year-round, even in the driest summers. There's a well near the house, too, newly dug last year." As they made their way back to the house, Olivia was quiet, deep in thought. Hank gave her the space she needed, not wanting to pressure her. Finally, as they stood on the porch, she turned to face him. "If I accept your offer, Mr. Barrett, I want everything in writing. As you said, a proper business arrangement." Hank's heart lifted. "Of course. Whatever terms make you comfortable. I would contribute to the property's upkeep and improvement," she continued. "Any excess produce from the garden would be sold, with profits divided fairly. I would maintain the house and land in your absence." "That sounds more than fair," Hank agreed. "And one more thing," Olivia added, her voice taking on a note of determination. "My child will never be made to feel unwelcome or burdensome. This must be a true home for both of us." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Hank said sincerely. "Your child will be safe and respected here." "You have my word." Olivia studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of insincerity. Finally, she nodded. "Then I accept your proposal, Mr. Barrett." Relief and something akin to joy washed over Hank. He extended his hand, and Olivia placed hers in it, sealing their agreement with a handshake that felt strangely momentous. "When would you like to move in?" he asked. "The place needs some work, but it's livable now. I could have it ready in a few days." "After the papers are signed," Olivia replied practically. "And I'd like to spend a bit more time with Mrs. Wilkins. She's been teaching me how to prepare for the baby's arrival. Perhaps by the end of next week." "That sounds perfect," Hank said. "I'll speak to Mr. Graves today about drawing up the agreement." They returned to the wagon, where Thomas waited patiently, and began the journey back to town. As they rode, Hank found himself making mental notes of all the repairs and improvements needed at the property. The roof needed patching in places, The pump at the well required attention, and the fences around the garden would need reinforcing before spring. For the first time in years, he was thinking beyond the next cattle drive, planning for a future that suddenly seemed full of purpose. Beside him, Olivia watched the landscape pass by, her own thoughts turning to the possibilities that lay ahead. After months of fear and uncertainty, the promise of a safe haven for herself and her child seemed almost too good to be true. Yet there was something about Hank Barrett that inspired trust, a steadiness, a quiet integrity that resonated within her. As the wagon crested a small hill, giving them a last view of the property before it disappeared from sight, Olivia allowed herself to hope that perhaps she had found not just shelter, but a new beginning. The following days passed in a flurry of activity. True to his word, Hank arranged for the legal papers to be drawn up, taking care that they protected Olivia's interests as much as his own. The agreement granted her the right to live on the property indefinitely, with specific provisions for the care and maintenance of the house and land. Most importantly, it clearly stated that her child would have equal rights to remain there, regardless of circumstances. When Mr. Graves presented the finalized documents, Olivia read them carefully, impressed by their thoroughness and fairness. She signed her name with a steady hand, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders as she did so. Meanwhile, Hank devoted himself to preparing the house. He hired local men to help with the more substantial repairs, fixing the roof, repairing the chimney, reinforcing the porch. He purchased new bedding, kitchenware, and other necessities. Mrs. Wilkins proved an invaluable ally, advising him on what a young mother-to-be would need and helping to make the house truly habitable. Word of the unusual arrangement spread quickly through Ardmore. Some tongues wagged with speculation and judgment, but others, particularly those who had observed Hank's character over his periodic visits to the town, defended his actions as simple Christian charity. Dr. Collins made a point of expressing his approval publicly, which did much to silence the worst of the gossip. For her part, Olivia spent the time preparing for both the move and the baby's arrival. Mrs. Wilkins taught her to knit, and together they created small garments for the coming infant. The older woman also shared her knowledge of childbirth and infant care, information Olivia absorbed eagerly. A week after viewing the property, Olivia was ready to move in. The morning of the departure, Mrs. Wilkins presented her with a basket filled with practical gifts: baby clothes, soft blankets, herbal remedies for common ailments. "You're a strong woman, Olivia Nash," the older woman said, embracing her, "and you found a good man in Hank Barrett, whether either of you realizes it yet or not. But remember this: your strength doesn't mean you have to face everything alone. Send word if you need me, day or night." Olivia blinked back tears, touched by the kindness of this woman who had been a stranger just days ago. "Thank you for everything, Mrs. Wilkins. I don't know what would have happened if—" "None of that now," Mrs. Wilkins interrupted briskly. "You look forward, not back. That's the only way to build a life worth living." Hank arrived with a wagon he'd purchased specifically for the property, another investment in this new, unexpected future. He loaded Olivia's few possessions, along with the supplies and furnishings he'd acquired, and helped her up onto the seat. As they drove away from the boarding house, Olivia felt a curious mixture of emotions: anxiety about the unknown path ahead, gratitude for Hank's extraordinary generosity, and an unfamiliar feeling that might have been hope. "Nervous?" Hank asked, noticing her pensive expression. "A little," she admitted. "It's been a long time since I had a real home." Hank nodded, understanding. "It'll take time to feel settled, no rush." They arrived at the property to find a surprise waiting for them. Several of the men who had helped with the repairs had returned along with their wives to welcome the new residents. They had brought food: a freshly baked ham, bread, preserves, and pies, and small gifts for the house. "Mrs. Wilkins suggested it," explained Mrs. Peterson, the blacksmith's wife, as she showed Olivia the quilt they had pieced together. "Said you might appreciate a proper welcome to Ardmore." Olivia was overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. These people didn't know her story. didn't judge her circumstances, they simply saw a young woman in need of community and responded with open hearts. The impromptu gathering lasted through midday, with the neighbors helping to arrange furniture and put away supplies before taking their leave. By late afternoon, Olivia and Hank found themselves alone in their shared home for the first time. "Well," Hank said somewhat awkwardly, "I hope today wasn't too tiring for you." "Not at all," Olivia replied, settling into a chair by the fireplace. "It was wonderful, actually. I didn't expect such a warm welcome. Folks around here are good people, mostly," Hank said, building up the fire against the evening chill. "Once they accept you as one of their own, they'll stand by you." Olivia watched him work, noting the efficient way he arranged the logs and kindling. Everything about Hank Barrett spoke of capability: his calloused hands, his practical approach to problems, the quiet confidence in his movements. Yet there was gentleness too, evident in how carefully he had prepared the house for her arrival, how he always positioned himself to offer support without imposing. "Mr. Barrett," she said suddenly, "I realized I never properly thanked you for all of this." Hank looked up from the fire, embarrassed. "No need for that, and please call me Hank. Seems odd to be so formal when we're sharing a home." Olivia smiled. "Then you must call me Olivia, and there is a need to thank you, Hank. What you've done for me and my child, it's extraordinary. I want you to know that I recognize the magnitude of your kindness, and I'm deeply grateful." Hank stood, brushing ash from his hands. "It's not entirely selfless," he admitted. "Like I said, I've been drifting too long, needed something more permanent, a place to belong between drives." He gestured around the cozy room. "This benefits me too." "Even so," Olivia insisted, "you could have secured a property without taking on a pregnant stranger and her child. You made a choice that most men wouldn't. I won't forget that." Uncomfortable with her gratitude, Hank changed the subject. "Are you hungry? I could heat up some of that ham and bread the Petersons brought." Olivia recognized his discomfort and allowed the shift in conversation. "That sounds wonderful. I'll help." "No need," Hank said quickly. "You rest. It's been a long day, and in your condition." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "My condition doesn't prevent me from preparing a simple meal, Hank. We agreed this would be a partnership of sorts. I intend to carry my weight." Hank looked chagrined. "Of course, I didn't mean to imply otherwise." Together, they prepared a simple supper, establishing a rhythm in the kitchen that felt surprisingly natural. As they ate at the small table, Hank outlined his plans for the property. "The garden needs attention before winter sets in," he explained. "I thought I'd clear it tomorrow, harvest what's still good. The chicken coop needs rebuilding before we can get any hens, but that can wait until spring, and I want to repair the fence along the creekside before I leave for my next drive." "Leave?" Olivia repeated, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "You're leaving soon," Hank nodded. "I've got a contract to move a herd to San Antonio starting in 3 weeks. Should take about a month round trip depending on the weather." Seeing her concerned expression, he added, "But I'll make sure everything is in good order before I go, and Dr. Collins promised to check on you regularly." Olivia composed herself quickly. "Of course, I knew you would be away driving cattle. That was our arrangement." She forced a smile. 3 weeks gives us plenty of time to prepare." Later that night, as Olivia lay in her new bed, she reflected on the day's events and the strange turn her life had taken. A month ago, she had been alone, homeless, and desperate, convinced that her future held nothing but hardship and shame. Now she had a roof over her head, a community beginning to accept her, and a partner of sorts in Hank Barrett. She placed a hand on her rounded belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her palm. "We're going to be all right," she whispered, as much to reassure herself as her unborn child. "We have a home now." In the other bedroom, Hank too lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of having another person in the house. The soft footsteps as Olivia moved about her room, the creak of her bed as she settled in for the night, these small domestic noises stirred something in him. A longing for connection he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He thought about the cattle drive ahead, his first since acquiring the property. Before, he had always welcomed the open trail, the freedom of movement, the simple clarity of the cowboy's life. Now, for the first time, he found himself reluctant to leave, already calculating the days until he could return. The realization was unsettling. He had been careful not to make promises he couldn't keep, not to offer more than practical assistance. Yet already he felt a responsibility toward Olivia that went beyond their business arrangement. He wanted to ensure her happiness, her security, not just her survival. As sleep finally began to claim him, Hank pushed these thoughts aside. There would be time enough to sort through his feelings in the weeks ahead. For now, he had a property to prepare, a woman to protect, and a new purpose that both exhilarated and terrified him. The next 3 weeks passed in a flurry of shared work and gradual adjustments as Hank and Olivia established a routine in their new home. Each morning began with breakfast together, planning the day's tasks over coffee and whatever simple meal Olivia prepared. Then they would separate to their respective duties, Hank working outside on the endless repairs and improvements the property required, Olivia tending to the house and garden. Despite her advancing pregnancy, Olivia insisted on contributing meaningfully to the work of the homestead. She cleared and organized the long, neglected pantry, preserved the remaining vegetables from the garden, and transformed the smaller bedroom into a welcoming nursery with the help of items donated by their neighbors. Her training as a teacher served her well, as she created an orderly, efficient household from the somewhat chaotic collection of possessions Hank had assembled. For his part, Hank found himself working with renewed energy and purpose. He rebuilt the chicken coop, repaired the sagging fence line, and cleared a section of overgrown land adjacent to the garden where he planned to plant corn in the spring. In the evenings, he often sat on the porch, sketching plans for future improvements, a proper smokehouse, an expanded garden, a small orchard of peach and apple trees. Through it all, they maintained a careful politeness, each respectful of the other's space and privacy. Yet inevitably, living under the same roof fostered a growing familiarity. Hank learned that Olivia hummed softly to herself while working, old hymns her father had taught her. Olivia discovered that Hank was surprisingly well-read, with a dog-eared copy of the Iliad that he revisited in quiet moments. They began to share stories over supper, Hank's adventures on cattle drives, Olivia's experiences teaching in Galveston. As the day of Hank's departure approached, a subtle tension developed between them, neither willing to acknowledge the uncertainty of the separation ahead. Olivia busied herself preparing food that would keep during his journey, while Hank redoubled his efforts to leave the property in perfect order. The night before he was to leave, they sat together on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Olivia had knitted a scarf for Hank's journey, practical and warm, which he had accepted with touched surprise. The Peterson boy agreed to come by every few days to check on the heavier chores, Hank said, breaking a comfortable silence. And Dr. Collins said he'd visit weekly. Mrs. Wilkins promised to send Thomas out if you need anything from town. You've thought of everything, Olivia observed with a small smile. I'll be fine, Hank. This isn't my first winter, you know. No, but it's your first winter here, he replied, and with the baby coming. The baby isn't due for at least 6 weeks, Olivia reminded him. You'll be back before then. Hank nodded, though concern still creased his brow. If the weather turns bad, or if anything happens, anything at all, send word to San Antonio. The cattle buyer knows how to reach me on the trail. I will, Olivia promised. But try not to worry. Focus on your work and staying safe. We'll be here when you return. The simple statement, "we'll be here when you return," affected Hank more deeply than he expected. The idea of having someone waiting for him, a home to come back to, was both foreign and profoundly appealing. I'm glad you accepted my proposal, he said suddenly, surprising himself with the admission. Having you here, it's made this place feel like more than just a property. Olivia's cheeks flushed slightly in the fading light. I'm glad too, she said softly, more than I can say. For a moment, something hovered between them, unspoken feelings, uncertain possibilities. Then Hank stood, breaking the spell. Best get some rest, he said. I'll be leaving before dawn. Olivia nodded, allowing him to help her to her feet. "Safe travels, Hank. God go with you." The next morning, Olivia woke to the quiet sounds of Hank's departure, the soft clomp of his boots on the wooden floor, the gentle closing of the door. She rose and moved to the window, watching in the gray pre-dawn light as he mounted his horse and rode away, a solitary figure disappearing into the mist that clung to the valley. The house felt immediately different without his presence, emptier, quieter. Olivia placed a hand on her belly, feeling the now familiar movements of the child within. "It's just us for a while," she murmured, "but he'll be back, he promised." The days following Hank's departure fell into a new rhythm. Olivia found plenty to occupy herself, continuing to organize the house, preparing for the baby, even beginning to plan lessons for when she might eventually teach again. The Peterson boy, Caleb, came faithfully every other day to chop wood, check the livestock Hank had acquired, and perform other tasks too strenuous for Olivia in her condition. Dr. Collins visited weekly as promised, his weathered face crinkling with approval at Olivia's improving health. "You're blooming, Miss Nash," he declared during one examination. "Country living agrees with you." Mrs. Wilkins sent regular packages with Thomas books to pass the long evenings, fabric for baby clothes, letters full of practical advice and town gossip. Other neighbors stopped by occasionally, bringing food or simply company, ensuring Olivia was never truly isolated despite the property's distance from town. Yet despite these connections, Olivia found herself missing Hank with an intensity that surprised her. It wasn't just his practical help around the homestead that she longed for, but his quiet presence, his dry humor, the sense of security she felt in his company. In the evenings, she often found herself sitting in his preferred chair by the fire, trying to imagine where he might be on the trail, whether he was safe, warm, well-fed. 2 weeks after Hank's departure, the weather turned. A cold front swept down from the north, bringing freezing rain that coated the trees and fields in glittering ice. Olivia woke one morning to find the world transformed into a crystalline landscape, beautiful but treacherous. Caleb arrived that afternoon, his young face pinched with cold despite the heavy scarf wrapped around his neck. "Pa says this weather might last a while, Miss Nash," he reported as he brought in an extra load of firewood. "Said to make sure you're well stocked, just in case." "Thank you, Caleb," Olivia replied, concerned by the news. "Do you think you'll be able to come tomorrow if the ice continues?" The boy hesitated. "Pa said probably not. The road gets real dangerous when it's like this, but he said we'll come check on you as soon as it's safe." After Caleb left, Olivia took stock of her supplies. There was plenty of food, smoked meat, preserved vegetables, flour, coffee, and enough firewood to last at least a week. She had candles and oil for the lamps, books to occupy her mind. She would be fine, she assured herself, even if isolated for several days. That night, as the wind howled around the eaves and ice pellets tapped against the windows, Olivia felt the first twinge of real fear since moving to the property. Not for herself, she was warm and safe inside the sturdy house, but for Hank, somewhere out on the trail with a herd of cattle, possibly facing this same storm without adequate shelter. She placed a hand protectively over her belly, feeling the baby kick vigorously in response. "Your guardian angel is a stubborn man," she told the child, "but he knows his business, he'll be all right." She hoped desperately that she was speaking the truth. The storm continued for 3 days, leaving the property encased in ice. As Caleb had predicted, no visitors came. Olivia maintained her routine as best she could, rationing the firewood to ensure it would last, keeping herself occupied with household tasks and preparations for the baby. On the 4th day, the sun finally emerged, beginning the slow process of melting the ice. By midday, Olivia heard the welcome sound of a wagon approaching. Wrapping herself in a shawl, she stepped onto the porch to find Dr. Collins climbing down from his buggy. "Miss Nash," he called, his breath visible in the cold air. "Thought I'd better check on you after that blow. Are you well?" "I'm fine, doctor," she assured him, relieved to see another human face. "Please, coming out of the cold." Inside, Dr. Collins examined her carefully, nodding with satisfaction. You've weathered the storm admirably, both you and the little one. Another few weeks, I'd say, before your time comes. Have you had any news of the cattle drivers? Olivia asked, trying to keep her voice casual. With the storm, I wondered. Dr. Collins's expression grew serious. The storm hit further south as well, I'm afraid. Word came yesterday that some herds were caught in it. Men and cattle lost in some cases. Olivia's hand flew to her throat. Hank, Mr. Barrett, do you know if? No specific news of his outfit, the doctor replied gently. The telegraph lines are still down in some areas, but Hank Barrett is an experienced trail hand, Miss Nash. If anyone could guide his men and cattle safely through such weather, it would be him. Olivia nodded, forcing herself to remain calm. Of course, I'm sure he's fine. But in the days that followed, as the ice melted and life in the valley began to return to normal, Olivia found herself watching the road with increasing anxiety. Caleb resumed his regular visits, bringing news from town, but there was no word from or about Hank. A week after the storm, Mrs. Wilkins arrived unexpectedly, climbing down from Thomas's wagon with a determined expression. Thought you might use some company, she announced, embracing Olivia warmly. And I brought supplies. That storm depleted everyone's stores. Olivia welcomed her gratefully, and the two women spent the day working together, baking bread, mending clothes, preparing the nursery further. It wasn't until evening, as they sat by the fire with cups of tea, that Mrs. Wilkins broached the subject that clearly weighed on both their minds. Still no word from Mr. Barrett, she asked directly. Olivia shook her head. Nothing, and Dr. Collins said there were cattle drivers lost in the storm. Mrs. Wilkins reached over to pat Olivia's hand. Now, don't borrow trouble. Hank Barrett has survived worse than an ice storm. The man fought through the war, drove cattle through Indian territory, and once survived 2 weeks lost in the Llano with nothing but his knife and wits, if the stories are true. I didn't know that, Olivia said, surprised. Despite their weeks living together, there was still much about Hank's past that remained a mystery to her. He doesn't talk about it much, Mrs. Wilkins acknowledged. Not one to boast, our Mr. Barrett, but he's resourceful and tough as old leather. Mark my words, he'll be back, probably with some tale about how he sheltered the entire herd under a rock ledge or some such nonsense. Olivia smiled despite her worry. You're probably right, I find myself thinking about him much more than I expected to. The older woman's eyes softened with understanding. That's natural enough given your circumstances. He's been kind to you when others weren't. Grateful feelings can sometimes be confused with other kinds of attachment. It's not just gratitude, Olivia admitted quietly, surprising herself with the confession. There's something about him, a goodness that isn't showy or self-righteous but runs deep. I've never met anyone quite like him. Mrs. Wilkins studied her thoughtfully. Well. Perhaps there's more to your business arrangement than either of you realized when you entered into it. Olivia flushed. I'm being foolish. Hank has been nothing but proper and respectful. He's never indicated any interest beyond providing you a home, preparing for your child as if it were his own, and working himself to exhaustion to ensure your comfort and security, Mrs. Wilkins interrupted dryly. Yes, clearly the man is indifferent. Before Olivia could respond, a sharp pain gripped her abdomen, causing her to gasp and clutch at her belly. Mrs. Wilkins was immediately alert. What is it, child? The baby? Olivia nodded, breathing carefully as the pain subsided. Just a twinge, doctor. Collins said these false pains might come and go before the real labor begins. Mrs. Wilkins narrowed her eyes. How long have you been having these twinges? On and off since this morning, Olivia admitted, but they're irregular and not very strong. The older woman said skeptically. I think perhaps I'll stay the night, just to be sure. Thomas can return to town and let my boarders know. Despite Olivia's protests that she was fine, Mrs. Wilkins was adamant. As the evening progressed, the pains came more frequently, though still manageable. By midnight, there was no denying that Olivia's labor had begun in earnest. I'll send Thomas for Dr. Collins, Mrs. Wilkins decided, helping Olivia to her bedroom. You're progressing faster than I expected for a first baby. Olivia gripped the older woman's hand, suddenly afraid. It's too early. Hank isn't back yet. He said he wanted to be here when. Babies come when they're ready, not when it's convenient, Mrs. Wilkins said firmly. And right now, this little one is deciding it's time to meet the world. Hank Barrett will just have to catch up when he can. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and focused effort for Olivia. Mrs. Wilkins proved an excellent midwife, her practical experience complementing Dr. Collins's medical knowledge when he arrived shortly before dawn. Together, they guided Olivia through the increasingly intense contractions, offering encouragement and support as she labored. As the first light of morning filtered through the bedroom window, Olivia gave a final, exhausted push, and her child entered the world with a robust cry that filled the small room. "A boy," Dr. Collins announced triumphantly. "A fine, healthy boy, Mrs." Wilkins quickly cleaned the infant and placed him in Olivia's trembling arms. "Look at him, child, perfect in every way." Olivia gazed down at her son, overwhelmed by a love so fierce and immediate it took her breath away. His tiny face was red and wrinkled, his fists clenched as if ready to fight the world, but to her, he was the most beautiful sight she had ever beheld. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm your mother," as Dr. Collins attended to the afterbirth and Mrs. Wilkins bustled about cleaning up. Olivia counted her son's fingers and toes, marveling at each perfect digit. He had a dusting of dark hair, and when he briefly opened them, eyes of deep blue that she suspected might darken with time. "Have you thought of a name, Mrs.?" Wilkins asked, bringing a cup of strengthening tea to Olivia's bedside. Olivia nodded. She had been considering names for months, weighing different possibilities. "Henry," she said softly. "Henry Nash." Mrs. Wilkins raised an eyebrow. "Henry, as in Hank." Olivia met her gaze steadily. "It's a good, strong name, and I would like him to have something of the man who gave us a home when no one else would." The older woman nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "It suits him. Young Henry Nash has a fine ring to it." In the days that followed, Olivia adjusted to life with a newborn, grateful for Mrs. Wilkins's continued presence and practical assistance. The baby proved to have a healthy appetite and a surprisingly calm disposition, sleeping peacefully between feedings and regarding the world with solemn curiosity when awake. News of the birth spread quickly through the scattered community around Ardmore. Neighbors visited with gifts and good wishes, each exclaiming over young Henry's robust appearance and offering predictions about his future based on various folk beliefs and superstitions. Through it all, Olivia found herself watching the road, hoping each approaching rider or wagon might be Hank returning at last. But as days stretched into a week, and then nearly two, there was still no sign of him. "You must prepare yourself, child, Mrs." Wilkins said gently one evening as they sat by the fire, Henry sleeping peacefully in a cradle Caleb's father had crafted. "It's been nearly 6 weeks since Hank left. If something happened during that storm—" "No," Olivia said firmly, "I won't believe that." "He promised he would return, and Hank Barrett keeps his promises." Mrs. Wilkins sighed. "Your faith does you credit, but life on the frontier is uncertain at best. Men make promises with the best of intentions only to have fate intervene." Olivia looked down at her sleeping son, feeling a fierce protectiveness surge within her. "We'll be all right either way," she said, more to herself than to Mrs. Wilkins. "Hank made sure of that. This home, the legal papers, he provided for us even if he couldn't return." "Yes, he did," the older woman agreed. "Which tells you something about the man's character, doesn't it? And his feelings, whether he expressed them directly or not." Before Olivia could respond, the sound of hooves approaching at a rapid pace drew their attention. Mrs. Wilkins moved to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. "A rider," she reported. "Coming fast." Olivia's heart leapt, but she tempered her hope. It could be anyone, a messenger, a traveler seeking shelter, a neighbor with urgent news. She carefully lifted Henry from his cradle, holding him close as Mrs. Wilkins went to the door. The sound of the horse pulling up outside was followed by hurried footsteps on the porch. Then the door swung open and there stood Hank Barrett, his clothes trail worn and mudded, his face haggard with exhaustion but very much alive. For a moment, no one spoke. Hank stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes moving from Mrs. Wilkins to Olivia, and finally to the small bundle in her arms. His expression shifted from relief to wonder to something deeper and more complex. "You're here," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "You're both all right." Olivia couldn't speak past the knot in her throat. She merely nodded, tears of relief and joy spilling onto her cheeks. Mrs. Wilkins, practical as ever, broke the spell. "Of course they're all right. No thanks to you, Hank Barrett, taking your sweet time getting back here. Nearly gave this poor girl a heart attack with worry." Despite her scolding tone, there was a smile in her eyes. "Well, don't just stand there letting all the heat out. Come in and meet your namesake." Hank stepped inside, removing his hat with hands that trembled slightly. "Namesake," he repeated, confusion evident in his voice. Olivia found her voice at last. "This is Henry," she said softly. "Henry Nash." He arrived 2 weeks ago, a bit earlier than expected. Hank moved closer, his eyes never leaving the infant. "Henry," he echoed. "You named him." He looked up at Olivia, a question in his gaze. "After the man who gave us a home," she confirmed. If that's all right with you, all right." Hank repeated, his voice thick with emotion. I'm honored, more than I can say." Mrs. Wilkins cleared her throat. "I think I'll go see about some supper. You two have catching up to do." She bustled out to the kitchen, giving them a moment of privacy. Hank sank into a chair, his exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "The storm caught us south of Austin," he explained. "Lost some cattle, but got the men through safe. Then the rivers flooded, blocking the trail. Took us nearly 2 weeks to find a safe crossing. I've been riding hard for 3 days to get back." He trailed off, his eyes returning to Henry. Would it be all right if I looked at him?" Olivia moved to his side, carefully lowering herself to sit next to him. "Of course." With infinite gentleness, she adjusted the blanket to reveal Henry's sleeping face. Hank stared, transfixed by the tiny features, the delicate eyelashes, the perfect bow of his lips. "He's beautiful," he whispered. "Perfect, he is," Olivia agreed, watching Hank's reaction closely. "Would you like to hold him?" Hank looked startled, then uncertain. "I've never held a baby before. My hands are rough and I'm filthy from the trail." "We trust you," Olivia said simply, and carefully transferred Henry into Hank's arms, showing him how to support the baby's head. Hank sat motionless, cradling the infant with a reverence that brought fresh tears to Olivia's eyes. Henry stirred slightly, his tiny fist escaping the blanket to wrap around one of Hank's weathered fingers. The simple, instinctive gesture seemed to affect Hank deeply. His eyes glistened as he looked from the baby to Olivia. "I'm sorry I wasn't here when he came," he said quietly. "When you needed me." "You're here now," Olivia replied, "and we managed. Mrs. Wilkins has been a godsend." Hank nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "On the trail, especially after the storm hit, I found myself thinking about you, both of you, more than I should have, worrying, wondering." He met her eyes directly. "This arrangement we made, it started as a practical solution, but I think it might have become something more, at least for me." Olivia's heart quickened. "For me as well," she admitted softly. "These weeks you were gone, I realized how much I've come to care for you, Hank, not just for what you've done for us, but for who you are." Hank looked down at Henry, then back to Olivia, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "I don't have much to offer beyond what I've already given. I'm not an educated man like you deserve, or wealthy, or particularly refined, but if you'd consider. That is, if you might someday think of me as more than just a partner in this property." "I already do," Olivia said, reaching out to place her hand over his where it cradled Henry. "You're the most honorable, decent man I've ever known. And these past months, watching how you've prepared this home for us, how you've respected my independence while ensuring our security. I've come to admire you deeply, to cherish your presence in our lives." Hank's expression transformed, hope and joy erasing the lines of exhaustion. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Olivia smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I'm saying that Henry and I would be honored if you would consider being more than just our landlord and protector, if in time you might consider being a true father to him." And perhaps someday a husband to me. For a moment, Hank seemed speechless, overcome by emotion. Then, with exquisite care, he leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss on Olivia's forehead. "Nothing would make me happier," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "But we'll take it slow, do things proper. Court as we should have from the beginning if circumstances had been different." "I would like that," Olivia agreed. In the kitchen doorway, Mrs. Wilkins watched the scene unfold, a satisfied smile on her face. Her boarders had wagered that Hank Barrett would never settle down, that his offer to Olivia had been mere charity with no deeper meaning. But she had seen something in his eyes that first night at the boarding house, a recognition, a connection that went beyond simple kindness. And she had been right. "Supper's ready whenever you are," she announced, stepping into the room. "Though you look like you could use a wash and some rest first, Hank Barrett, you're swaying where you sit." Hank looked up, still cradling Henry protectively. "I reckon you're right, Mrs. Wilkins. It's been a long road home." Olivia reached out to take Henry, allowing Hank to stand. "Welcome home, Hank," she said softly. "We've been waiting for you." The months that followed brought profound changes to the small homestead in the valley. True to his word, Hank courted Olivia properly, with respect for her new motherhood and the conventional expectations of their neighbors. They attended Sunday services together in Ardmore, took walks when weather permitted, and spent evenings by the fire discussing books, dreams, and plans for the future. Henry grew steadily, his personality emerging curious, determined, and quick to smile, especially at Hank, whom he seemed to recognize instinctively as a protector and friend. Hank, for his part, approached fatherhood with the same quiet competence he brought to all tasks, learning to change diapers, rock the baby to sleep, and interpret his various cries and expressions. Spring arrived, bringing new life to the valley. The garden Hank and Olivia had prepared the previous fall yielded its first tender shoots. They added chickens to the property, and a milk cow named Daisy who provided fresh milk for the growing household. With Hank's guidance, Olivia learned the rhythms of rural life, when to plant and harvest, how to preserve food for the leaner months, which wild plants could supplement their diet. In April, 6 months after Henry's birth, Hank took his first cattle drive since returning home. The separation was difficult for all of them, but necessary for the financial stability of their growing family. Olivia, now confident in her ability to manage the homestead alone, sent him off with promises to write regularly and to take good care of herself and Henry. 4 weeks, Hank promised as he prepared to leave. "No longer, and when I return," he paused, uncharacteristically hesitant. "When I return, if you're still of the same mind, I thought we might speak to the minister about setting a date." Olivia's heart soared at his words. "My mind hasn't changed, Hank, nor will it in 4 weeks." True to his word, Hank returned exactly 4 weeks later, his saddlebags heavy with the proceeds from the cattle sale and small gifts for both Olivia and Henry, a pretty shawl for her, a carved wooden horse for the boy. The following Sunday, they spoke to Reverend Thompson after services, and a wedding date was set for midsummer. The news spread quickly through the community, met with general approval and offers of assistance with the preparations. Mrs. Wilkins immediately appointed herself wedding coordinator, organizing the women of Ardmore to provide food, decorations, and practical advice for the bride-to-be. "Never thought I'd see the day," Dr. Collins remarked good-naturedly to Hank as they shared a drink at the town's small hotel. Hank Barrett, confirmed bachelor, settling down with a wife and child. "Neither did I," Hank admitted with a smile. "Funny how life takes unexpected turns." "Not so unexpected to those who were paying attention," the doctor replied sagely. "I saw the way you looked at Miss Nash that very first night at Mrs. Wilkins' boarding house. Some connections are evident from the start, even if the parties involved take a while to recognize them." On a perfect July evening, with the setting sun painting the valley in gold and crimson, Hank Barrett and Olivia Nash were married under an arch of wildflowers in the garden of their home. Henry, now 10 months old and recently taking his first steps, was held by Mrs. Wilkins during the ceremony, his excited babbling providing occasional counterpoint to the minister's solemn words. The gathering was small but joyful neighbors who had become friends, townsfolk who had embraced Olivia despite her unconventional arrival in their community, and a few of Hank's longtime trail companions who had cleaned up impressively for the occasion. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them man and wife, and Hank kissed Olivia with tender reverence, the assembled guests erupted in cheers and applause. Henry, startled by the noise, began to cry until Hank scooped him up, settling him comfortably between his new parents. "A family," Olivia whispered, her heart full to bursting as she looked from her husband to her son. "Our family. Always," Hank promised, his voice rough with emotion, "no matter what comes." The celebration continued well into the night with fiddle music, dancing, and enough food to feed half of Ardmore. When the last guests had departed, Olivia and Hank stood on the porch of their home, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. "Are you happy?" Hank asked, his arm around his wife's waist. Olivia leaned into him, feeling the solid strength of his presence. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied truthfully. "When you found me on those church steps, I had nothing but fear and uncertainty ahead of me. Now I have everything: a home, a family, a future." Hank kissed the top of her head. "You gave me those things too, you know. Before you, this was just land and a house. You and Henry made it a home." As the years passed, the Barrett homestead flourished and expanded. Hank continued to drive cattle seasonally, but with each passing year, he spent more time at home, gradually transforming from cowboy to rancher. With the proceeds from his drives and Olivia's careful management, they purchased adjoining land, built a larger house, and diversified their operation to include more crops and livestock. Henry grew into a strong, thoughtful boy with his mother's quick intelligence and his father's quiet determination. When he was 4, he welcomed a sister, Emma Rose Barrett, born on a stormy spring night with her father pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door and Mrs. Wilkins once again serving as midwife. 2 years later, the family expanded again with the arrival of Samuel James Barrett, completing their family. Olivia eventually returned to teaching, establishing a small school on their property that served their children and those of neighboring families. Her reputation as an excellent educator spread, and soon families from Ardmore were sending their children to learn from Mrs. Barrett's Academy, as it came to be known. Hank, watching his wife thrive in her vocation and his children grow strong and capable, often marveled at the unexpected path his life had taken. The solitary cowboy who had once valued independence above all else now found his greatest joy in the connections that bound him to others, to his wife, his children, his land, his community. On the 10th anniversary of the day he found Olivia on the church steps, Hank rose early and slipped out of the house before the rest of the family woke. He rode to the highest point on their property, a gentle hill that overlooked the valley where their life together had unfolded. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the fields and pastures they had cultivated together, he reflected on the words he had spoken that fateful evening. "You're not alone anymore." How little he had understood then the true meaning of those words. He had offered them as comfort to a desperate woman, never imagining that in rescuing her, he was also saving himself from a loneliness he hadn't fully acknowledged. When he returned to the house, he found Olivia in the kitchen, already preparing breakfast for their brood. At 32, she was more beautiful to him than ever, her face softened by motherhood, her eyes bright with contentment and purpose. "You were up early," she observed, accepting his kiss with a smile. "Special plans for today?" "Just thinking," Hank replied, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she worked at the stove. "About beginnings and how they lead to places we never expect." Olivia turned in his embrace, her expression thoughtful. "Are you referring to a particular beginning?" "One that involved church steps and a very pregnant schoolteacher," Hank nodded, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. 10 years ago today, I nearly rode past, you know, almost didn't hear you over the wind." "But you did," Olivia said softly. "You heard me, you stopped, and you changed everything." From the doorway came the sound of small feet and childish voices as their 3 children tumbled into the kitchen, full of morning energy and hungry for breakfast. Henry, now a lanky 10-year-old with his father's steady gaze, led the charge, followed by Emma with her mother's dark hair and quick smile, and little Sam, still in his nightclothes, clutching the wooden horse Hank had given Henry years ago. "Papa." Emma cried, launching herself at Hank with complete confidence that he would catch her. "You promised to show me how to saddle Pepper today, remember?" "I remember," Hank assured her, lifting her high, "after your lessons with Mama." "And you said I could help with the new calves," Henry reminded him seriously. "You said I'm old enough now." "That I did," Hank agreed. "You're becoming quite the rancher." As the family settled around the table for breakfast, the usual cheerful chaos of their mornings unfolding, Hank caught Olivia's eye across the table. The look they shared held a decade of shared history, challenges overcome, joys celebrated, a love that had grown deeper and stronger with each passing year. "Not alone anymore," he murmured, too quietly for the children to hear. Olivia's smile was radiant with understanding and love. "Never again," she promised, "for any of us." And in that moment, surrounded by the family he had never expected to have in the home they had built together from hope and hard work, Hank Barrett knew with absolute certainty that stopping for a cry in the darkness 10 years ago had been the single best decision of his life. What had begun as an act of simple human kindness had blossomed into a love story still unfolding, day by day, season by season, year by precious year.